Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healthy Living live stream. Well, hello again, everyone, and welcome to the Healthy Living live stream. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. Today, I'll be talking about smoothies and may have some controversial information to share. But first, let me tell everyone about my True Masculinity mini series, which opened last night, where I gave a talk about what is true masculinity. And it is not too late to register. Lecture number 2 is tomorrow, where I will be talking about nutrition for men. And I'll be actually expanding on some of the topics I'm going to mention in today's smoothie lecture. So you'll definitely want to sign up for that and tune in for that free 3-episode mini course. All right, now on to today's topic of smoothies. Many times people approach me and tell me that they have a super healthy diet. And one of the number one things they say that they eat is smoothies, thinking that these are a high quality health food or a superfood of some sort. And of course, many of us out there will brag about our favorite smoothie ingredient or recipe. Well, let me tell you that in general, I have a bias against smoothies, and let me give you some of my personal reasons, and then I'll talk about more objective evidence. If we look back at ancient man or animals in nature, we certainly don't see any smoothie consumption whatsoever, right? We are meant to eat foods in their natural, raw, whole form. And for this reason alone, I kind of reject smoothies, which are a way of processing foods, and often processed ingredients are added to smoothies, which make it not something that would have ever been in our natural diet. Now, if we look at this a little bit more objectively, there are several factors, some from common sense and some from research, which make this type of eating a little bit risky. So one thing is portion size. So let's say that we were to compare a fruit smoothie to eating fruit in its whole form. Well, we would perhaps eat a piece of fruit and then see how we feel. And if we were still hungry, eat another one. But with smoothies, we have to decide ahead of time how much we're going to eat. And this could easily lead us to overeating unintentionally. And I'll pair that with some evidence, because the satiety has been looked at in research of blended fruits versus eating the whole fruit, and also with juices, by the way, which doesn't contain the fiber. And it's shown that there's decreased satiety and increased hunger after consuming smoothies compared to eating the whole fruit. Now, let me just define what smoothies are and what I'm talking about so you better understand. And this is food ingredients, usually fruits, sometimes vegetables, that are blended. So they're mechanically processed into a puree type texture, and they still contain the fiber from the plant foods. Whereas juice, which can be processed in different ways, will take the fiber and separate it out so that the liquid is much less viscous and just contains the soluble ingredients from the fruit. So those are the differences. Now, with either juices or smoothies, you skip the step of chewing because these are essentially liquid foods. So this allows a couple of things. One is it allows you to consume a given amount of food much more quickly, and juices are the quickest, but smoothies are still way quicker than eating the whole food. And this is one of the factors that's been shown to be related to satiety. And also, you may miss on the opportunity of engaging the teeth and the jaw muscles, which is perhaps beneficial. And there are big trends out there related to that you can look into separately. In fact, there are even some folks saying that there may be atrophy of the jaw muscles, and this may have cosmetic consequences for people who eat a lot of liquid diet. Now, another thing that happens when you process fruits in this way is that they are more prone to become oxidized. And this is especially relevant if you plan to make a smoothie ahead of time and consume it later. And this is because the surface area of the chemicals that would become oxidized is increased by the mechanical breakdown of the food matrix. And another thing that occurs is that if there are any significant amounts of plant defense chemicals, things like oxalates, for example, which there may be high levels of in some smoothie ingredients like spinach, these can have potentially a deleterious effect as well because they'll be more bioavailable, just as the nutrients are said to be. So I mentioned the food matrix briefly, and I'd like to define what that is because it's highly relevant to this issue. And the food matrix also is something that is only really recently began to be studied, but is some clear research on how our glycemic system, the system that processes carbohydrates, is affected by this. So the food matrix is the three-dimensional structure that food comes in its raw form. So, for example, if you had a whole grain or a piece of a fruit or a vegetable, there would be an arrangement of plant cells, including the cell walls, that would contain constituents that were inside the cell. Then there would be the extracellular matrix, which is a network of proteins, and there will be various ingredients distributed throughout that in a three-dimensional space. So the sugar, for example, that may be in fruit in the food matrix, it will be distributed in a three-dimensional arrangement throughout the fruit. And in order for the body to access many of these nutrients, it has to first break down this matrix to release these constituents or expose them surface area wise to the digestive enzymes. And as a consequence of that, the nutrients get released more slowly when the food matrix is intact. So in studies, for example, that looked at the glycemic index, they looked at blending various plant foods, and they looked at things that wouldn't necessarily be smoothie ingredients as well, things like corn, and found that the glycemic index, or how the body processes the sugar, is definitely altered when those plant cell walls and the food matrix is broken down. So this leads us to the main topic of reactive hypoglycemia, which is, or it could be called postprandial hypoglycemia. And in the common language, this is what we refer to as being hangry or having hanger. And if we can bring up the first slide, it kind of shows this cycle where we eat a dose of carbohydrates. Now, the carbs should be in their free form. In other words, not intact in a food matrix, but separated so that they're in free solution. And when you eat foods like that, and these are foods that contain as an ingredient, of course, simple sugars, but also fruit juices and fruit smoothies, that it causes the body to respond to that quick rise in the blood sugar by secreting insulin, but too much insulin. It overreacts. And this is because of the nature of how quickly the blood sugar rises after eating a meal like this. And then in about 60 to 90 minute time period, the body will actually have the blood sugar drop too low, lower than the normal set point or the beginning point. And this creates the symptoms that we might call hanger. So irritability, it can cause a little bit of a headache, shakiness, etc., and drives the hunger response so that you can eat again and correct the problem. But if you eat these types of foods again, you're going to repeat the cycle. Now, this comes from a couple of studies, if we can bring up the next slide, that were done quite a long time ago. So this was published in 1977 in The Lancet. And I apologize that it's a little bit difficult to tell which line is which in the graph, but I want you to focus your attention to the graph on the right. And this looks at the response of the blood sugar after consuming either apples in their natural intact form or two types of purees of apples, which would be like a smoothie, and two types of juice. And it has to do with how quickly it was consumed. So if people sipped it more slowly, they had a slightly different response than if they chugged it. And what you can see here is that the graphs all started with the plasma glucose, the blood sugar, around 65 to 70 range. And then after eating the juice or the puree or the fruit, you can see that the blood sugar went up. And it actually went up a little bit higher in the intact apples. But here's what happened after that is that it began to come down. And this is because of that insulin response that I discussed. Now, in the top graph, which is separated from the others, you can see those are the regular apples. And when the blood sugar came back down in response to that insulin, it came back down to about the same level that it started at. And that is what we should normally expect to see when eating a healthy meal. But in the other cases, and to varying degrees, the blood sugar actually went below the baseline, as low as 50 in one of the juice groups. So we could see that this effect is slightly more pronounced with the juice, which has the sugar in free solution and no fiber. And it's a little bit less pronounced in the blended apples or the puree, where the fiber is still there, but it's separated from the sugar. In other words, it's not in the intact matrix. But in both of these cases, you have the effect of that the sugar goes too low, that's hypoglycemia, after consuming this meal. Now, if we look at the next slide, here is another study that looks at orange juice on the left and grape juice on the right. And I think this is quite interesting because you see that the effects are still there, but they are present in the actual fruit itself in its intact form, which is not true for apples. So you see the graph on the left is oranges, and you can see the top line is oranges and the bottom line is orange juice. And they both dip down below the baseline levels. But here's the difference that you see with the oranges, it rebounds back up to the baseline level pretty quickly, but the orange juice is delayed. So there would potentially be a more pronounced hanger effect with the orange juice. Now with grapes, it's even more interesting because here you have that there's really no difference between the grapes and grape juice, and both of them result in the sugar going too low, and it is sustained up at least until 3 hours time because these graphs go out to 180 minutes. So we can see that there may be some variability depending on which fruit you add to your smoothies, but some of these fruits, even in their natural raw form, are going to have this issue with rebound hypoglycemia. Now, over time, repeated experience of the body to this type of sugar load is one of the things that is said to lead to diabetes and other metabolic problems. So this does have potential long-term health consequences. Now, so that's really the main story on sugar. Now, of course, many smoothies, especially ones that are prepared at smoothie bars or cafes, are going to have added sugar or added fruit juice. So this effect is going to be even more pronounced when those things are added. And I don't recommend artificial sweeteners as a good substitute because they have their own host of problems, meaning that they increase hunger for carbs at future meals, and that's been established in research. And then many of them have direct neurotoxicity. And I would refer you to the work of Dr. Russell Blaylock for more information on that. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how smoothies are used by athletes for muscle building, which really means protein powders. So this is a very, very popular trend, and especially with, I believe, people who have a poor diet, that they feel they need this extra performance from protein powders, and they're very popular around the gym and in various types of athletic competitions, and especially with respect to muscle building. But there are many problems with using protein powders, and where this really all comes from is that the research does show that if you combine increased protein intake, and this doesn't reflect the source of the protein, with resistance training, that you do have increased muscle growth compared to not increasing the protein in your diet. However, we know that there are many foods that have protein that we can add to the diet or change the composition of our diet to achieve this same effect. So what are the problems with protein powders? Well, one kind of obvious one is that proteins in nature, right, the high protein foods, generally also the protein is combined with fat. And our body is set up to digest protein and fat together. But in smoothies, the proteins are combined with simple carbs. So this is not the natural way for our body to absorb it, and there could be unknown effects or limitations with taking it this way. Now, also, most of these protein powders are sold in plastic packaging. And because this is a powder, it has more surface area that comes in contact with the plastic. So there's a possibility that it could absorb more of the plasticizing compounds, which include xenoestrogen compounds like phthalates and bisphenols. So this is something I didn't look for specific data on, but anything in plastic packaging that's food potentially has this risk, and powders and liquids have more of a risk of drawing these constituents out of the plastic than certain solids. So, sorry, where was I? So I want to also talk about the common ingredients in these protein powders. So I went and searched for, the best protein powders out there, and found an article from Forbes magazine and took the top two by category. So one was the top animal-based protein powder, and the other was the top vegan-based protein powder. And you can bring up the slide now. So this is the top animal-based protein powder, and I highlighted the most questionable ingredients, although these, just to consider, these are processed proteins taken from plants. And many of the time, although it's not reported as an ingredient, industrial solvents, things like hexane, for example, are used to extract proteins and other things out of these plants. So there could be trace amounts of various industrial chemicals present in order to get the processed protein powders. And this, can be true even if it's an animal source of the protein. So here, the highlighted ingredients: organic high oleic sunflower oil. So this is one of the very unhealthy seed oils that contains high levels of oxidized omega-6 fatty acids. Then you have other ingredients like rice dextrin, sunflower lecithin, erythritol. It does have they often have artificial sweeteners. In this case, it's stevia extract, which also is problematic. Guar gum and xanthan gum. So these are obviously not proteins. All these other ingredients, these have to do with how this powder is processed and to increase the shelf life and to prevent clumping and change the texture and things like that, which are unnecessary when you actually eat food. Now, on the next slide is the top. I'm sorry, that was the vegan one. I misspoke. The next one is the top animal-based, and this is made from whey, which is what's left behind in milk after you remove the curds. And we can see also problematic ingredients here, tapioca starch, rice flour. Now, these are processed carbohydrates that your body quickly breaks down into simple sugars, so they will increase the effect of the reactive hypoglycemia. Of course, there's sugar added. There is sunflower oil. Once again, seed oils are common ingredients. Sodium bicarbonate, artificial flavors, guar gum, xanthan gum, maltodextrin, acetylsame, potassium, which is, I believe, an artificial sweetener as well, and sucralose, another artificial sweetener. So when you are adding these protein powders to your smoothies, you're, in addition to adding some purified proteins or peptides, you're also adding a bunch of processed chemicals, some man-made and some food-derived, and then trace amounts of other chemicals that are not disclosed in the ingredient list. And as we know from the generally regarded as safe category, that most of these food additives are not ever tested for safety or toxicity. And even if they are, it's generally they're tested for acute toxicity rather than chronic low-level exposure. So there are lots of issues. Now, I also, because I want to mention to the bodybuilding crowd that also the composition of protein, amino acids, is very, very important for muscle building and for health. And so if you're going to increase the protein, you need to very carefully consider the source of the protein and how close does the composition of amino acids reflect what I need for my dietary and what actually human muscle contains. And so I just wanted to bring up a couple of quick slides to show some food comparisons of the protein composition. And this first slide, it lists on the left side the what's called the essential amino acids for humans, which are ones that our body can't make and we need to get from dietary sources. And you could see here, this is a comparison of a standardized amount of food, 100 grams of all of the foods listed on the top, and how much of each amino acid in the essential amino acids are contained in that amount of food. And you can see a big divide from left to right between salmon and lentils, that all of the meats and eggs on the left have much higher levels and have very similar ratios of these essential amino acids. And with perhaps the exception of chicken eggs, because chickens are a very different species and the embryos have different dietary requirements than an adult. But in all the other food, you can see that these ratios are very similar because all of these animals are somewhat similar to each other in their metabolism and dietary needs and body composition, right? All have muscle, fat of varying kinds, whereas plants have an entirely different anatomy and are made of very different molecules. So if we look at the plants on the right, we have a couple of beans, and then we have some processed protein products, tempeh and tofu, which I believe both are soy derived, although tempeh might be rice derived. And you can see that the ratios are quite different and the absolute amounts are not nearly as high. So if we are using plant proteins, we have to be very careful to combine them in the right way to try to approximate the correct ratio as much as possible, although I would recommend avoiding the fake meat type of products like tempeh and tofu, because once again, they have also trace chemicals from the extraction process, and then any soy-based products will have phytoestrogens, which could work against your anabolic steroid system in terms of muscle building. So if you'd like to find out more about proper nutrition and technique about muscle building and athletic performance, please register for the True Masculinity mini-series because tomorrow night's lecture will be on that very topic. Okay, so I've kind of outlined the problems with smoothies. And so let me tell you what I recommend as a solution to avoid any of these pitfalls. So, one thing is if you really love smoothies, instead of having them as a regular dietary replacement or supplement or aid for your workouts, try to make them instead an occasional treat that you give to yourself. And also with the particular ingredients, um, certain fruits and vegetables are going to be healthier and perhaps have less of a negative glycemic effect than others. Try to avoid adding processed ingredients and sweeteners as much as possible when you do make these. But in general, um, it would be good if you are building muscle or trying to gain weight, for example, to increase the protein in your diet, but be very careful to get the protein from actual food, whole food sources. Pay attention to the composition and quality of the protein from different food sources and use that as your guide, and make sure that you eat those foods without adding a bunch of sugar and carbs to the meal for optimal digestion and absorption. When it comes to eating fruit, it's better to eat the whole fruit in its natural form rather than to juice it, blend it, or otherwise process it. So thank you for your attention on this topic. I'm sure there have been some debates going on in the comments, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
Right. Excellent presentation, Andy. I really enjoyed it.
No, thank
Let's
you.
get to Kane O'Brien. What about animal-based smoothies, quote unquote, containing raw eggs, dairy, like yogurt, milk, or kefir, cream, etc., or raw honey?
Well, certainly some of those ingredients that you mentioned can be quite healthy. If raw eggs can certainly be consumed safely, as well as raw dairy. I don't necessarily think adding honey is a good idea because one, you're then again combining protein with carbs, which is not the natural form. And even with honey, still is the possibility of this reactive hypoglycemia, although I haven't looked to see if there's any direct studies on that. But so, if you want to have a glass of raw kefir and add a raw egg to it, certainly that is a very reasonable way to get some nutrition.
All right. Excellent. Let's go to LOL. What's the safest way to build muscle without these powders? Trying to eat more protein through meat, but it gets very filling quickly.
Well, one thing is that following your body's hunger signals will actually get you the right amount of food. And in order to build muscle, right, you have to have strength training. It's not going to just happen spontaneously unless you're taking steroids. So the strength training, especially if done properly, is going to increase your appetite. So then you're going to consume more protein. So you're going to have more raw materials in order to build more muscle. It's very, very important when building muscle to also have adequate rest, because what you may not realize is that when you're at the gym pumping iron, that's not when the muscle growing is occurring. That's when you're putting stress and actually injuring the muscle, not to a pathologic degree, but you're causing some damage at the cellular and intracellular level. And that is the stimulus for the muscle to grow so that next time you give it that load, it will be better able to withstand it. But that process doesn't happen immediately. There is a recovery period where healing goes on, and then it shifts into muscle building. So it's important to have optimal muscle growth that you give it the adequate rest period. And this is going to, of course, vary from individual to individual, across age groups, and also depending on how advanced you are at strength building, because the heavier load you put on, in general, the more recovery time you'll need.
Right. We have a question from Peter. My friend takes these workout shakes all the time, and although he has muscle mass, his face looks aged and developed prostate issues. I always wondered if the shakes were the problem.
Well, it's of course impossible to answer that question without more information, but certainly it could be part of it, and it could also be part of a bigger thing. So we'd have to look at the entire lifestyle of your friend to see what's going on. But there are many things that can contribute to ill health, and most of them are related to processed food. And also drinking a lot of smoothies could indicate that you have a sweet tooth, and then you're also craving lots of other carbs all the time and eating those as well. So I think we'd have to look at the whole picture, but there are definitely some risks to overuse of smoothies.
Absolutely. Last question from Rich. Are there any fruits that you don't want to specifically mix in your smoothies or mix in general, i.e. berries with bananas debate?
Well, there actually is some data on berries, and they have been shown to have less of this rebound hypoglycemic effect. And it's been postulated that the reason is because of the seeds in the berries. So like blackberries, blueberries, raspberries all have little seeds. Now, normally when we eat these berries whole, we don't break down the seeds or digest them, right? They just pass right through us. And this is part of the strategy for the plants to get their seeds spread around so that they can grow, new bushes and trees in different locations. But the mechanical processing of smoothies actually breaks down the seeds and then releases their constituents into the smoothie. And part of what they have in there is some additional fiber, which may slow down the absorption of the sugar. Also, berries tend to have less sugar than many of the other fruits, especially bananas, which are very high in sugar. But also the seeds of some berries are high in polyphenols, which can partially inhibit glucose absorption. So all these factors may play a role. And, there are some fruits that may be a little bit less risky to put in your smoothies than others, for sure. And you can do your own research to see what else the data may show.
Right, excellent. Now, guys, that's about it for all the questions. Make sure that sign up, register for the True 3-day True Masculinity mini series happening tomorrow at 8 p.m. ET. And if you have any final remarks before we close it off, Andy.
Well, it's great to see everyone here today, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow evening to learn more about men's nutrition. And as always, we'll be back next Wednesday at noon with another Healthy Living live stream. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Kaufman.
Take care, everybody.